A sensory receptor is a structure that reacts to a physical stimulus in the environment, whether internal or external. It is a sensory nerve ending that receives information and conducts a process of generating nerve impulses to be transmitted to the brain for interpretation and perception. In a sensory system, sensory receptors serve as a frontliners because they are the contact with the stimulus. Taste and odor have receptors molecules which undergo a process of binding to chemicals in the stimuli. For the types of the sensory receptors, for mechanoreceptors, it is a physical stimuli, for example, pressure, touch, sketch, motion, and sounds. For the thermoreceptors, it can detect heat or cold. For the chemoreceptors, it can emit solute, for example, taste and smell. Next is the electromagnetic receptors. It can detect EM energy. And lastly, pain receptor. It responds to excess heat, pressure, and chemicals. And here are the examples of sensory receptors.
Reception versus perception. Reception and perception are different from one another in such that the welcoming stimuli from nerve endings is termed as reception, the deciphering of impulses from receptors and the giving of connotation to the stimuli is termed perception. Sensation, on the other hand, is when the brain distinguishes sensory stimuli through a sensory pathway. Action potentials from sensory receptors travel along neurons that are dedicated to a particular stimulus. An example is the human ear. Sound waves travel into the ear canal until they reach the eardrum. The eardrum passes the vibrations through the middle ear bones or ossicles into the inner ear. The inner ear is also called the cochlea. Inside the cochlea, there are thousands of tiny hair cells. These hair cells change the vibration into electrical signals that are sent to the brain through the hearing nerve. This is a reception part of hearing. When the brain interpreted the information and signals, we call that as perception. Another example is the vertebrate eye. The images we see are made out of light reflected from the objects we look at. This light enters the eye through the cornea, which acts like a window at the front of the eye. The amount of light entering the eye is controlled by the pupil, which is surrounded by the iris, the colored part of the eye. Because the front part of the eye is curved, it bends the light, creating an upside-down image on the retina. The brain eventually turns the image the right way up. The retina is a complex part of the eye, and its job is to turn light into signals about images that the brain can understand. Only the very back of it is light sensitive. It's packed with photosensitive cells called rods and cones. Cones are the cells responsible for daylight vision. There are 3 of kinds, each responding to a different wavelength of light: red, green, and blue. These cones enable us to see images in color and details. Rods are responsible for night vision. They are sensitive to light but not to color. In darkness, the cones do not function at all.
A skeleton is a hard structure that protects the internal organs of the living thing. Skeletons can be inside the body or outside the body. We have 4 types of skeleton. First one is hydrostatic. It is a fluid held under pressure in a closed body compartment. We have exoskeleton. It is a hard encasement on surface of animal. And lastly, endoskeleton. It is a hard supporting elements buried within soft tissues.
The muscular system is responsible for the movement of the human body. So, muscles, a band or bundle of fibrous tissue in a human or animal body that has the ability to contract, producing movement in or maintaining the position of parts of the body.
Muscles can only contract. They cannot actively extend, though they can move or relax back into the non-contracted neutral position. Therefore, to move bones in opposite directions, pairs of muscle must work in opposition. Each muscle in the pair works against the other to move bones at the joints of the body. The muscle that contracts to cause a joint to bend is called the flexor. The muscle that contracts to cause the joint to straighten is called the extensor. When one muscle is contracted, the other muscle from the pair is always elongated. The skeletal muscle structure. Muscles are attached to bones by tendons. There are 3 types of muscle: the cardiac, the skeletal, and the smooth. Cardiac muscle, also known as heart muscle, is the layer of muscle tissue which lies between the endocardium and epicardium. These inner and outer layers of the heart, respectively, surround the cardiac muscle tissue and separate it from the blood and other organs. Cardiac muscle is controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Cells in your brain and cells embedded throughout your heart act to release well-timed nervous impulses, which signal your heart cells to contract in the correct pattern. Next is the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is a voluntary muscle, which means that we can actively control its function. It is attached to the bone and forms a distinct organ of muscle tissue, blood vessels, tendons, and nerves that covers our bones and allows movement. Skeletal muscle often exists in pairs, whereby one muscle is the primary mover and the other acts as an antagonist. For example, when you bend your arm, your biceps contracts, while your triceps is relaxed. When your arm returns to the extended position, it is the triceps that contracts and the biceps relaxes. Smooth muscle is a type of muscle tissue which is used by various systems to apply pressure to vessels and organs. Smooth muscle is composed of sheets or strands of smooth muscle cells. These cells have fibers of actin and myosin which run through the cell and are supported by a framework of other proteins. In smooth muscle, the contraction is controlled by signals from the autonomous nervous system, such as nerve impulses, hormones, and other chemicals released by specialized organs.
One long fiber is equal to single muscle cell. Then each muscle fiber is a bundle of myofibrils composed of actin, the thin filaments, and myosin, the thick filaments. Actin and myosin filaments slide against each other and are responsible for the muscle contraction.
In muscle contraction, the sarcomere relax and actin and myosin overlap. Contraction is stimulated by motor neurons. Length of sarcomere is reduced and actin slides over myosin. When fully contracted, the actin and myosin completely overlap. Note that the thick and thin filaments slide past each other to increase overlap. Muscle contraction occurs by being stimulated by a motor neuron. Acetylcholine is produced that initiates the whole process. As muscle fiber polarize, calcium ions is released, initiating the sliding of the filaments by binding to troponin and exposing myosin sites on actin. Through the process of hydrolysis of ATP by myosin, a cross bridge is formed between the filaments in which then the thin filaments will be pulled toward the center of the sarcomere, resulting in a muscle contraction. Here are the different types of skeletal muscle fibers. The speed of muscle contractions are dependent on the fibers that is present. Fast fibers corresponds to brief, rapid, powerful contractions, while slow fibers correspond to sustained long contractions or posture. Here are few diseases that may affect the skeletal muscle system, like ALS, which causes the degeneration of motor neurons and muscle fibers atrophy, botulism, which blocks the release of acetylcholine that also paralyzes muscles, myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune disorder that produces antibodies to acetylcholine, calcium deficiency that causes muscle spasms and cramps, and rigor mortis commonly occurs after death which the body stiffens.